Welcome to today's Extra Special here on Breakfast Extra. Today, we're discussing a topic that strikes at the very heart of democracy: freedom of the press. Our recent developments in Nigeria have raised serious concerns about whether the press is being silenced. Under the administration of President Bola Tinubu, reports of harassment, threats, and even illegal detention of journalists have surfaced. Investigative journalists, editors, and news reporters have found themselves the targets of intimidation by security forces, some held in custody for days without trial.
From the abduction of Segun Olatunji by armed men linked to the Defense Intelligence Agency, the arrest of Daniel Ojukwu for his investigative reporting on corruption, the arrest and arraignment of whistleblower Bristol Isaac Tamuno Biri Theory, also known as PDOM, and now the Nigeria Police Force has alleged that investigative journalist David Hundeyin and another individual identified as Michael Temidayo Alade are accomplices of PDOM. It seems the media landscape is facing unprecedented pressure.
Yet, despite these alarming incidents, the government insists that it supports freedom of expression. So, is Nigeria's media under threat, is the question. And what does this mean for the future of journalism and accountability in the country? So joining us today to explore this issue are, well, we've got distinguished guests here with us. And first we have Mr., of course, David Hundeyin, who we've had on the show before, who has faced firsthand the risk of reporting on sensitive issues. Thank you very much for joining us, David. Good to have you here.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So first, let's ask your take on the current situation of freedom of expression, especially when it comes to journalists such as yourself in Nigeria. What do you think the landscape is currently regarding that?
Well, I think the events of the last week tell a story on their own. Technically, right now, you're having a conversation with someone who is apparently wanted in connection with the criminal investigation in Nigeria. And what egregious crime has this person allegedly committed? Well, the crime is that this person committed journalism, because that's now a significant offense in Nigeria. And I'm not the only one. My colleagues at FIJ, for example, Fisayo Soyombo and Daniel Ojukwu, are both either wanted by the police or have actually spent time in police detention this year already. In fact, in Daniel's case, he wasn't even arrested. He was abducted from Lagos and taken to Abuja without anybody's knowledge. And for about 48 hours was held completely incommunicado. And all of this happened because of a story that he wrote. And incidentally, the police division that was responsible for this abduction, that's the National Cybercrime Center, is the exact same police division that was also responsible for the abduction of PDOM from Port Harcourt also to Abuja. And even worse is that even after Daniel was eventually able to get out, which was many months ago, he is still required monthly to report to Abuja. His passport is still held by the police. So he's essentially held hostage in Nigeria, and he's required to report to Abuja monthly, which is very expensive, right? And if he doesn't do that, then his bail will be revoked. So that in itself is another tactic for sort of trying to keep a critical reporter, a journalist that they do not like, on the leash. And we are some of the lucky ones, because at least that's in the instance where it's still the police that is involved. In some other cases, including my case, as recently as last year, it wasn't the police. It went far higher than that. So last year, I actually survived an attempt on my life, which was spearheaded by the National Intelligence Agency under the director who was just sacked by the president, Ahmed Rufai Abubakar, whom under his leadership, the NIA made an attempt to end my life in Ghana, where I was resident at the time. And this was as a result of a leaked document which I put out. Bear in mind, I wasn't actually even responsible for the leak, because the leak came from the military, but I merely put out the document which I thought was in the public interest, in the interest of preventing a war that I think it's fair to say nobody wanted, and a war which would not have been in Nigeria's a national interest anyway, a war which was being sort of puppeted from Paris, in which West Africans would have died for the benefit of some European power. And for that egregious crime, an attempt was made on my life and I had to flee to Kenya. And then when I was in Kenya, a further attempt, a diplomatic attempt was made to try to sort of lean on the Ghanaian government, because obviously I use a Ghanaian passport nowadays. An attempt was made to lean on the Ghanaian government to revoke my passport and effectively render me stateless in a foreign country, which would have put me inside all kinds of trouble. And eventually I had to move to the UK. And since then, I've sort of been in that sort of, limbo status. So that's just like a really quick snapshot, and it goes even further than that. So if you draw the line back a bit further, then you get to people like Jafar, who did the now infamous story of the politician, the then governor of Kano State, Umar Ganduje, who is now a senior member of the APC. Apparently stuffing dollars into his Bavariga, and he got video evidence of this, and he published it, and his entire life was turned upside down. His entire family had to be relocated. Until today, he can't really come back,
Right.
and the status quo remains. So we are in this sort of really weird situation now, where we have an administration which is headed by people who claim to have been senior members within the so-called Nadeko movement during the Abacha era. People who in some cases actually ran sort of, insurgent, independent media establishments, such as the infamous Radio Kudirat. And those people are now in government, and they are now taking on the press in a manner that is just as violent and just as incredible as
Right.
the manner in which Sani Abacha did.
David, I'm glad you're saying this, because then it begs to now ask the question, right, about Nigeria and whether it's this administration, the past administration, the military dispensation or regime, or now our democratic era. Why has the Nigerian ruling class struggled with dissent? Why does it continually struggle with press and holding them accountable and doing its job? Why do you think so?
So that's actually quite a difficult question to answer, surprisingly enough, because it's a question that I ask myself all the time as well. The reason I say it's a difficult question to answer is that historically, it's not every president or every administration that has been this sort of prickly toward the idea of being criticized or being examined or being held accountable. I mean, as recently as 2015, Nigeria had a president who had it as, he counted it among his achievements. That he described himself as the most insulted president in the world. And by and large, people weren't getting chucked into jail or taken, abducted from their homes and taken into detention, and held incommunicado. All these crazy things, by and large, were not happening on a large scale as recently as 2015. And yeah, even drawing the line back further, going back to maybe 2007 when Umar Yar'Adua came into office. So between maybe 2007 and 2015, I think it's fair to say that was a period where Nigerians became accustomed to having a certain level of civil, liberty and civil freedoms that maybe hadn't been, in evidence prior to that. So why was it that in the case of Umar Yar'Adua and Goodluck Jonathan, we didn't really have these problems on a large scale, and then immediately after, in the cases of Muhammadu Buhari and especially Bola Tinubu, it's just gone to the moon, and it's like we're back in a Abacha era all over again? That's a difficult question to answer.
Right.
But the closest thing that I can hazard to a guess, which is in the neighborhood of the answer, would be that I guess you would say it's a function of what the motivations for holding power are that the members of the Nigerian ruling class have. In the case of Umar Yar'Adua, I think it's fair to say that he wasn't necessarily preparing himself to become the president. He didn't necessarily have that ambition. It was more a case of it being President Obasanjo's decision to make him the PDP candidate. So it almost seemed as if power was sort of kind of thrust on him in a way. And I think the similar dynamic repeated itself with his successor, who was actually his vice president,
Right.
Goodluck Jonathan, who did not expect to become president, and then it just sort of happened.
Now, David.
So I think,
David, I'm sorry, we're running
Yes.
out of time, but there's something you mentioned that I thought was very critical that we actually address here. And you said something about the press, and it's kind of like sounded like it was also implicating the press. You spoke about, especially in quote here, Radio Kudirat, and the fact that some of these people find themselves in governance now and are actually the ones who are suppressing the press currently. Does that implicate the press itself?
to an extent, it does, because as I've said several times, I feel like a lot of what we think of as journalism in Nigeria focuses on the how and not the why. So we know how to put together a story, we know all the nuts and bolts, the 5 Ws and the H, and we know how to do this as long as someone else is giving the instructions. But we don't really know the why. So in the case of those who were doing the whole Nadeco media movement thing, it's in some cases it's that they were just following instructions and they didn't really have any sort of ideological underpinning. They didn't really have any core ideological beliefs. They didn't necessarily understand why free media was so important or what the remit of the function it was that they were doing that was so threatening to the Abacha regime. They didn't really understand it. They're just following instructions. Some of those people, your bio onugas, we're seeing how they are in power now. They're just people who, anyway, beleface, as we say. And then in some other cases, there were people who were sort of very cleverly disguising themselves as sheep when they were in fact wolves, which means that they were not that different to the Abachas of this world. They just happened to be in a situation where their interests were not aligned, so they had to be in opposition to Abacha. So they then had to take on the mantle of free press, opposition media, and they had to sort of jump through these hoops. But as soon as they found their way into power, such as in the case of Bola Tinubu, as soon as he came into power in 1999, one of the very first things, and I'm sure you know this because you are in the media space as well, one of the first projects he set about doing when he came into power in Lagos State was to start paying off media heavily. So for one of his most famous legacies as governor, and even after his tenure as governor in Lagos, is that the media in Lagos is not critical to the government in Lagos. As a rule, that's just a fact. Through the Tinubu, Fashola, Ambode, Sanwo-Olu administrations, you can see that motif running through. The media in Lagos is always in lockstep with whatever the pirated agenda of the Lagos state government is. That's not by accident. That's a Tinubu legacy. That's because all through the while he was supposedly in this sort of media opposition to General Abacha, he himself had his own agenda in mind, and he himself knew that he wasn't that different to the Abachas of this world. It just so happened that their public interests were not well aligned at the time. So
what you're saying is that
now that
what you're saying that is
Sorry,
is
go
that
ahead.
he positions the media to his advantage. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
But the implication on
Exactly.
the press is a very, very loud one here, which is what concerns me. And I'm wondering whether it was a thing of the past or if you think that it's a thing currently still happening now.
It absolutely is currently still happening now. In fact, as someone who runs a small scale newsroom, one of the challenges which I currently am dealing with, and which I think everyone in my shoes will keep on having to deal with, is how to keep the newsroom operating without sort of falling into alignment with characters or with funding entities or with interests that one shouldn't fall into bed with.
All right, then.
Right,
All
because
Thank
there
you
are
very
people
much,
like-
David.
But David, it's really hard, isn't it? Given that, our job is by far one of the most least paid, we're some sort of quasi-celebrities, but even though we still struggle, we live paycheck to paycheck, and those who are on the ground doing the jobs are, they live by the honorarium, let's be honest, if we're being completely honest. But I have to ask you, in recounting your experience and that of Daniel Ojukwu and also that of Isaiah of FIJ, what then will be the willingness, for for journalists and investigators, or even the younger generation, to want to tell stories and, you know, cover the story and do right and hold power accountable? Is there ever going to be a willingness to do that?
So I think that willingness will always be there. I think it's a human condition. So I think that's not necessarily dependent on having a huge media background or ecosystem around you. What I think will happen going forward is that what we know as critical journalism or investigative reporting is going to more. And I think we've already started seeing what the future of this thing looks like. So you might be surprised to know that, or to hear that some of these people we think of as social media content creators, TikTok creators, the kind of stuff they do, in my opinion, is actually where investigative reporting is heading to in the future. Because what's going to happen is that as it becomes more and more difficult to run a huge, for example, a news central, which requires, you know, all kinds of investments, as that becomes more and more difficult or even impossible going into the future, and then that sort of critical reporting or investigative journalism, the need for it is still there and the desire to do it is still there. People will start finding new ways to do it. And I think we started seeing that, you know, whenever I'm asked this question, I always refer people to names that they might not have heard. So there's a guy on TikTok, for example, his TikTok name is True Crime Daniel. He doesn't describe what he does as investigative reporting. He describes himself as video content creator. But what he does is actually a form of investigative reporting. It's just not recognized as such yet. Maybe because, you know, the sort of orthodoxy hasn't really acknowledged it as such. But I think in the coming years, as journalism becomes more and more difficult to fund, because that is definitely a challenge which is getting worse, it's not getting easier, I think we're going to start seeing more of a shift. So I think we're going to start seeing a dichotomy. There's going to be the news centrals of this world who are going to keep on existing, and you know, thank God for that. But on the other hand, you know, where the smaller players in the space currently are, people like myself and, you know, FIJ and the likes of that, I think increasingly we're going to get replaced by a form of high quality citizen journalism, which we're starting to see on social media, especially as the barriers to entry for that type of creation become lower and lower. So.
Right. I mean, when you think about it in and of itself, evolution is always important, whether it's in every field, and that's really just one of the tenets of humanity. But finally, what's the hope for journalists? What's the hope for freedom of the press? There is the shield law that, you know, that shields journalists and, you know, protects them from any form of, you know, harassment or jail or arrest if their story is true, and it lies on everybody playing by that rule. But what's the last resort for journalists? Do you see the people in power and the judiciary and the lawyers and the policemen playing by the rule, the rule or the shield rule?
I don't see that, but the hope, if you like, that I do see is that eventually, no matter how historically docile or how historically absent the predilection toward active citizenship or civil disobedience, whatever it is, no matter how historically docile Nigerians might be, there will always be a breaking point. We haven't reached it yet. I don't know if we're going to reach it even in our generation, but eventually, as human beings that we are, there will always be some sort of tipping point. And I think when Nigeria does hit that tipping point, you won't have to tell Nigerians that journalists are the people who need to be protected first and foremost in what purports to be a democracy. I think Nigerians themselves are the ones who will start to sort of rally around journalism, find ways to fund it, find ways to ensure that journalists are physically protected, which is very important, and find ways to ensure that the rule of law becomes a thing which is actually respected by the government. It then becomes a political issue. I think right now it's not enough of a political issue. Right now, Nigerians are sitting back and waiting for the Nigerian system to tell the Nigerian system to do the right thing, which isn't going to happen. But I think as the Nigerian system keeps sort of stepping down on the figurative gas pedal and things continue to escalate at the rates that they're doing, bear in mind that not even under Abacha was the escalation this quick. Under Abacha, the escalation took 2 or 3 years. Under Tinubu, it's taking 9 months. So I think as this continues to escalate, eventually Nigerians will hit that tipping point, and then we will see some sort of change. I don't know what that change will look like. I'm looking forward to it as much as you are.
Well, we all wait to see. Well, thank you very much, David, for joining us again for a Saturday edition here on Breakfast Extra. It's always very insightful to have you on the show. Thank you indeed.
Thank you for having me.